For 79 years now, we've all been told the same story. April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler, cornered like a rat in his underground bunker, takes his own life rather than face justice. Eva Braun by his side. The Third Reich crumbles. The monster is dead. Case closed. But what if I told you that might be the biggest lie of the 20th century? What if everything you learned in school, everything you saw in those old newsreels, everything Hollywood showed you in countless war movies? What if it was all built on a foundation of quicksand? My friends, I'm about to share with you a story that will shake you to your core. A story that's been buried for decades, hidden in classified files, whispered about in government corridors, and dismissed by historians who were too comfortable with the official version to ask the hard questions. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory cooked up on the internet. This is the result of decades of meticulous investigation by veteran war correspondent Gerrard Williams, a man who spent his entire career chasing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Stay with me because what you're about to hear will change how you think about history itself. The evidence is mounting, the files are being declassified, and the truth is finally emerging. Let me take you back to those final days of World War II. Berlin was burning. You could hear the thunder of Soviet artillery getting closer by the hour. The Nazi war machine that had terrorized Europe was finally grinding to a halt. Now, if you're like most Americans, you probably picture that scene from countless movies. Hitler, that madman with the little mustache, pacing back and forth in his concrete bunker, ranting and raving as the walls close in around him. Then, in a moment of cowardice, he puts a gun to his head. Bang. The end. It's a satisfying ending, isn't it? Justice served. The villain gets what he deserves. We all sleep better knowing that evil met its match. But here's the thing that's been bothering investigative journalist Gerrard Williams for decades. Where's the proof? Really, where is it? Think about this for a moment. We're talking about the most wanted man in human history, the architect of the Holocaust, the man responsible for a war that killed over 50 million people. You'd think his death would be documented 6 ways from Sunday, wouldn't you? You'd expect photographs, dental records, an autopsy report. Hell, you'd expect the Allies to parade his corpse through the streets of Berlin just to prove to the world that justice had been served. But none of that happened. None of it. Instead, what we got was a story told by the Soviet Union, a regime that, let's be honest, wasn't exactly known for its commitment to truth. Stalin's boys rolled into Berlin, took control of the bunker, and basically said, "Trust us, we found Hitler's body." Well, what was left of it after we burned it? And the world? Well, the world was so tired, so ready to move on from the nightmare of World War II, that it just accepted it. No questions asked. Gerrard Williams wasn't satisfied with that. He's a journalist, you see. It's in his blood to ask questions, to dig deeper, to follow leads even when they take him to uncomfortable places. And what Williams discovered should have sent shockwaves through every history department, every government archive, every newsroom in the world. There has never been any independently verified forensic proof of Adolf Hitler's death. Let me say that again because it's important. Never. Not once. Not in 79 years. No confirmed autopsy. No photographs of the body. No authenticated remains. Nothing but the word of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. And if you lived through the Cold War like many of you did, you know how much their word was worth. The Western Allies, the Americans and the British, they never even got to examine the bunker. By the time they knew what was happening, the Soviets had already locked it down tighter than Fort Knox. The British sent historian Hugh Trevor Roper to investigate Hitler's final days. Good man, brilliant scholar. His book, The Last Days of Hitler, became the foundation for everything we thought we knew about Hitler's death. But even Trevor Roper had to rely on testimony from Nazi insiders. Think about that. Nazi loyalists, either fanatically devoted to their dead leader or terrified of what the Soviets might do to them if they didn't tell the right story. These testimonies contradicted each other left and right. Some said Hitler shot himself in the mouth. Others claimed he used cyanide. One witness described a completely incinerated body. Another said the corpse was barely burned. Yet somehow, all these conflicting stories got stitched together into one neat narrative. Why? Because the world desperately wanted closure more than it wanted truth. And what about physical evidence? Well, that's where things get really interesting, and by interesting, I mean deeply disturbing. The Soviets claimed they had skull fragments, dental evidence, but they kept it all locked away in Moscow. For 64 years, they refused to let any independent investigators examine these so-called remains. 64 years, folks. That's not how you handle evidence of the most important death of the 20th century. That's how you handle something you don't want anyone to look at too closely. Then, in 2009, something remarkable happened. American researchers finally got permission to test one of those skull fragments the Russians had been guarding so jealously. The results? Well, let's just say they weren't what anyone expected. The skull wasn't Hitler's. It wasn't even from a man. DNA testing proved it belonged to a woman under 40 years old. Some unknown woman whose identity we'll probably never know. That revelation should have triggered a complete re-examination of everything we thought we knew about Hitler's death. It should have been front-page news in every newspaper in America. Instead, crickets. Most historians shrugged it off as a minor error. The media mentioned it briefly, then moved on. The official story remained unchanged. Williams found this silence deeply troubling, and frankly, so should you. As he often asks in interviews, if this is the only physical evidence ever tied to Hitler's death, and it turns out it's not even his, how can we still call the story conclusive? But there's another side to this mystery, one that's even more disturbing, because while the world was accepting this questionable story about Hitler's death, something very strange was happening behind Soviet doors. Their story didn't just lack proof, kept changing, twisting, and contradicting itself. I've covered a lot of stories in my time, but there's something about the Soviet handling of Hitler's death that just doesn't sit right. It's like watching someone tell a lie, then forget what they said, then try to cover it up with another lie. On May 2nd, 1945, the Red Army finally broke through to Hitler's bunker. They were the first ones the only ones with access to Hitler's supposed final resting place. First, they said they'd found Hitler's body, burned beyond recognition. Victory, justice served. The fascist beast was dead. But then, just days later, they backtracked. Started saying maybe they hadn't found the body after all. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe. This flip-flopping went on for years, decades even. Joseph Stalin himself added to the confusion. Picture this. It's July 1945, just 2 months after Germany's surrender. Stalin's sitting across from President Harry Truman at the Potsdam Conference, and out of nowhere, he tells the American president that Hitler had probably escaped. Think about that for a moment. The leader of the Soviet Union, the man whose troops supposedly found Hitler's body, is telling the President of the United States that the Nazi leader might still be alive. This wasn't some chaotic democracy where different agencies might have different opinions. This was Stalin's Russia, where a wrong word could get you shot, where information was controlled with an iron fist. At a time when Stalin's government could track down dissidents in the remotest villages of Siberia, they couldn't seem to get their story straight about what happened to Adolf Hitler. Why would the Soviets play such a dangerous game with something so important? Williams has a theory, and it's chilling when you really think about it. He believes it wasn't confusion at all. It was strategy. By 1945, the Cold War was already starting to brew. Stalin understood something. Uncertainty is a weapon. If the West believed Hitler might still be alive, it would create exactly the kind of political instability and paranoia that Stalin could exploit. Disinformation wasn't a mistake in Stalin's playbook. It was a tool as carefully crafted as any rifle or tank. The Soviet investigation into Hitler's death was code-named Operation Myth. Even the name tells you something, doesn't it? They had a special unit working under SMERSH counterintelligence, gathering testimonies, collecting bone fragments, supposedly recovering dental remains. But none of it was ever made available for independent verification. Think about that. We're talking about the most important criminal case of the 20th century, and the evidence was locked away in Moscow, classified at the highest levels, hidden from the world. Take the dental records that everyone always talks about. That identification came from a dental assistant named Kathy Huserman, who was being held by the Soviets under interrogation. She was shown some dental bridges and asked to identify them. No photographs to compare them to, no dental files to check against. Just her word, given while she was in Soviet custody, probably terrified out of her mind. That became the foundation of forensic certainty about Hitler's death. If the Soviets truly had solid proof, why did they block any neutral investigation? Why keep Western intelligence agencies in the dark? Why did their version of events keep changing for decades? That 2009 DNA test posed, why were the FBI and CIA spending years chasing reports that he might still be alive? I want you to imagine for a moment that you're J. Edgar Hoover in 1947. You're running the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world. World War II has been over for 2 years. Everyone's telling you that Adolf Hitler is dead, case closed, move on. But reports keep coming across your desk. Reports from credible sources. Reports with specific details, geographic coordinates, witness testimonies. Reports claiming that the world's most wanted war criminal might still be alive. What do? Well, we now know what Hoover did, thanks to declassified documents. He investigated, and not just casually either. The FBI opened formal files, launched operations, and kept the case active for nearly 15 years. Reports poured in from South America, Europe, even Africa. Some seemed far-fetched, but others came with the kind of precise details that make seasoned investigators sit up and take notice. Let me tell you about one report from September 1947, written by an FBI informant living in Buenos Aires. The informant described a German man living under an assumed identity in a remote mountainous village in Argentina. The man was surrounded by guards, rarely spoke in public, and walked with a noticeable limp. The informant claimed this man had only one functioning hand and that local authorities treated him with unusual deference. Those details, the limp, the damaged hand, those match known facts about Hitler's physical condition. The FBI took it seriously. The file wasn't buried. It was cross-referenced, updated, expanded. Over the next few years, more reports came in from the same region. Different sources, different witnesses, but strangely consistent details. Even J. Edgar Hoover acknowledged the uncertainty in internal correspondence. He wrote that until a body was found and positively identified, the FBI could not rule out the possibility that Hitler had survived. Let that sink in. The head of the FBI couldn't definitively say that Adolf Hitler was dead. One detailed case came from a former SS officer captured in Spain. During interrogation, he claimed that Hitler had escaped the bunker through a secret underground route that led to a waiting aircraft. From there, he was flown to South America. Other informants, captured Nazis, diplomats, even Argentine locals, kept repeating similar details. Similar names, same locations, same escape routes over and over again. Williams found entire filing cabinets full of active investigations. Many files remained heavily redacted even decades after they were declassified. Key names blacked out, locations omitted, entire pages withheld under national security exemptions. Which raises an obvious question. If the world was so certain Hitler was dead, what national security threat could these old documents possibly pose? Hitler's name didn't disappear from intelligence watch lists in 1945. It lingered. In some folders, it remained active until the early 1960s. That's 17 years of official uncertainty about one of the most important questions of the 20th century. If the official story about Hitler's death was really as solid as everyone claimed, why were America's top spies spending decades looking for proof that it wasn't? And it turns out they had good reason to be suspicious. Because while the world was debating whether Hitler was dead or alive, thousands of other Nazi war criminals were definitely alive, and they were vanishing into thin air. They had help, organized help, the kind of help that could have made anyone disappear. When most Americans think about the end of World War II, they picture the Nuremberg trials, justice being served, war criminals getting their comeuppance. But what most people don't realize is that thousands of Nazi war criminals simply vanished. I'm talking about high-ranking SS officers, concentration camp commandants, war criminals with blood on their hands who should have spent the rest of their lives behind bars. Instead, they disappeared into what became known as the Ratlins, a sophisticated escape network that was so effective it could have helped anyone escape, even Adolf Hitler himself. The Ratlins were like something out of a spy novel, except they were real. Forged documents, sympathetic clergy, safe houses, bribed officials, coordinated international networks, all working together to help some of history's worst criminals start over. Let me give you some examples that'll make your blood run cold. Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer who organized the logistics of the Holocaust, the man who turned genocide into an industrial process, escaped to Argentina using the Ratlin network. He lived there for over a decade under the name Ricardo Clement, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory, raising a family. Nobody bothered him until Israeli Mossad agents finally tracked him down in 1960. Then there's Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, from Auschwitz. He escaped to South America and bounced between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil for decades, protected by local communities, funded by Nazi gold. He died in 1979, swimming in the ocean off the Brazilian coast. Natural causes. Never spent a day in prison for his crimes. The Vatican's role in these escapes has been controversial for decades. Some Catholic officials helped provide identity papers and safe passage. The International Red Cross unknowingly issued travel documents to fugitives traveling under false identities. But the real key was the political situation in South America, particularly in Argentina under Juan Perón. Perón welcomed Nazi immigrants with open arms. Between 1945 and 1955, an estimated 5,000 Nazis and collaborators settled in Argentina, many with official government support. 5,000. That's not a handful of low-level bureaucrats. That's a small army of war criminals, all living new lives under assumed names. If this network could smuggle thousands of Nazi fugitives to safety, why not one more? Especially one with more resources, deeper loyalty networks, and greater motivation to disappear than any other. German U-boats continued arriving in South America even after Germany's official surrender. U-977 surfaced off Argentina in August 1945, nearly 3 months after the war in Europe had ended. And then there's the money. The Ratlins didn't just move people, they moved wealth. Nazi gold, cash, valuable artwork used to buy protection, silence, and new identities. German-speaking towns sprang up in remote areas throughout South America. Places like Bariloche in Argentina became known for their Bavarian-style architecture and their secretive populations. These weren't temporary refugee camps. They were built for permanent reinvention. If Hitler had wanted to vanish, there would never have been a better time or place. The infrastructure was already in place. The funding was available. The political protection was guaranteed. And here's the most damning part. The Allies knew about it. As the Cold War heated up, former Nazis suddenly became useful. Operation Paperclip brought hundreds of Nazi scientists to the United States. Wernher von Braun, who built the V-2 rockets that terrorized London, became a hero of the American space program. While some former Nazis were being publicly celebrated, others were quietly disappearing through the Ratlins. This is the world that Williams has documented. A world where disappearing wasn't just possible for high-ranking Nazis, it was practically guaranteed. But infrastructure is one thing. What about witnesses? What about the people who might have actually seen Hitler in his South American exile? You know, there's something haunting about small towns. They remember things. Stories get passed down from generation to generation, whispered over coffee, shared when the grandchildren come to visit. In certain remote corners of South America, the stories that have been whispered for decades are about something far more sinister. Stories about a tall German man who rarely showed his face but cast a long shadow over entire communities. When Gerrard Williams began investigating Hitler's possible escape, he knew he had to go beyond government files. He had to talk to the people who might have actually been there, who might have seen something. What he found was consistent, detailed testimony from unconnected witnesses spanning different countries, different decades, different generations. Williams started in Argentina's Patagonian region, around the towns of Bariloche and Villa La Angostura. These are beautiful places, nestled in the Andes, surrounded by lakes and forests. But the people Williams spoke to remembered a time in the late 1940s and early 1950s when that isolation took on a more sinister quality. They talked about a large, heavily guarded estate hidden in the forest. Supplies were delivered under cover of darkness. Locals were paid generously to stay away and keep quiet. At the center of it all was a man they only knew as El Jeef, the boss. Williams met an elderly man named Esteban, whose father had worked as a delivery boy for the estate back in the early 1950s. The delivery boy was never allowed to look directly at the man who received the goods. But he couldn't help noticing details. The man was tall, with stiff posture. He had one withered hand. He spoke German when he thought nobody was listening. And he was always accompanied by armed guards. It was only years later, when the father saw old photographs from the war, that he began to wonder about the identity of El Jeef. This wasn't the only story Williams heard. Across the Andes in Chile, another community had preserved similar memories. They talked about a stone lodge they called La Casa del Alemán, the German's house. An old woman named Maria told Williams about her grandmother's encounter with the mysterious resident. The grandmother had been walking along a river trail when she saw a man in the distance, accompanied by 2 German shepherds and 3 armed men. "You did not ask questions," Maria explained. "You did not talk about it. You pretended you saw nothing." The fear in her voice, even decades later, was palpable. What struck Williams wasn't just the individual stories, but the patterns that emerged. Different villages, different countries, different witnesses, but they all described the same type of man. Tall, Germanic features, a noticeable limp, problems with one hand, always heavily guarded. These weren't recent stories influenced by documentaries. Many of the people Williams spoke to were sharing memories from the 1940s and 50s, long before anyone was seriously questioning the official version of Hitler's death. Williams also found physical evidence. European-style architecture in places where it had no business being. Airstrips near remote estates. High-security installations in areas with virtually no crime. One former tour guide gave Williams an old, grainy photograph showing a large compound surrounded by forest. The guide claimed this was El Jeef's estate from the 1950s, before it was mysteriously demolished. When Williams tried to verify the location through regional records, he found nothing. It was as if the estate had been erased from official memory. The consistency of details across unconnected sources was deeply unsettling. The physical descriptions matched known facts about Hitler's appearance. The behavioral patterns fit what you'd expect from someone hiding a terrible secret. Most importantly, many of these stories originated in areas where known Nazi war criminals had settled. If Adolf Eichmann could live openly in Buenos Aires for over a decade, if Joseph Mengele could bounce between 3 countries without interference, why couldn't someone like Hitler live quietly in the mountains, protected by wealth and silence? These witness accounts weren't definitive proof, but they raised questions the official story couldn't answer. But witness testimony, no matter how compelling, is still just testimony. For decades, the official story had at least some physical evidence to support it. Then, in 2009, science stepped in and changed everything. For over 60 years, one object had stood as the closest thing to forensic proof that Adolf Hitler died in his Berlin bunker. A fragment of human skull, charred and damaged, allegedly found by Soviet troops in May 1945. The Soviets claimed it was Hitler's skull. Western historians accepted their word. Textbooks referenced it. For 3 generations of students, this skull fragment represented physical proof that the Nazi nightmare had ended with Hitler's suicide. There was just one problem. Nobody outside the Soviet Union had ever been allowed to examine it properly. Then, in 2009, American researchers led by archaeologist Nick Bellantoni were finally granted permission to conduct DNA testing on the skull fragment. The results sent shockwaves through the historical community. The skull fragment wasn't Hitler's. It wasn't even from a man. DNA analysis proved, beyond any scientific doubt, that the bone belonged to a woman under the age of 40. The single most significant piece of physical evidence supporting Hitler's death belonged to an unknown woman, not to Adolf Hitler. This wasn't a minor discrepancy. This was clear, definitive proof that what the world had accepted as Hitler's remains for 64 years was nothing of the sort. The discovery should have triggered a complete re-examination of everything we thought we knew about Hitler's death. Instead, the revelation was met with uncomfortable silence. Some historians called it a minor error. Others doubled down on the remaining Soviet evidence, dental records that had never undergone independent forensic review. The media mentioned the DNA findings briefly, then moved on. The general public barely noticed, but Williams noticed. If the skull wasn't Hitler's, what did that say about the rest of the Soviet evidence? The dental identification that historians had long cited came from Kathy Huserman, a dental assistant held by the Soviets. She was shown some dental prosthetics and asked to identify them as Hitler's. No photographs to compare them against. No dental files to reference. Her testimony, given while she was in Soviet custody, became the foundation of forensic certainty about Hitler's death. So the official account of Hitler's death rested on unverifiable testimony, untested remains, and a skull that belonged to someone else entirely. In any legitimate criminal investigation, a case built on such flimsy evidence would be thrown out immediately. Williams saw the DNA findings as the moment when the official narrative collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. But instead of acknowledging the implications, the historical establishment circled the wagons. The story was too important to be derailed by inconvenient facts. The world didn't just want Hitler to be dead, it needed him to be dead. His death provided closure and the symbolic end to humanity's darkest chapter. But what if that satisfying ending was built on a lie? Try to imagine what it was like in the spring of 1945. For 4 long years, Americans had been reading about the horrors unfolding in Europe. Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the liberation of the concentration camps. Then finally it was over. The news came crackling over radio sets. Hitler was dead. The monster had taken his own life. The nightmare was finished. You could sleep soundly again, knowing that evil had been defeated. Now imagine if, instead of that clean ending, you'd been told, well, we're not really sure what happened to Hitler. He might have escaped. He might be hiding somewhere. We just don't know. How would that have felt? Williams believes that understanding this psychological dynamic is crucial to understanding why the world accepted such a questionable story about Hitler's death. It wasn't because the evidence was compelling. It was because the alternative was unbearable. After 6 years of total war, after the revelation of the Holocaust's horrors, humanity desperately needed closure. Hitler's suicide provided that closure in the most satisfying way possible. The villain had been punished. Justice had been served. The good guys had won. From a political standpoint, the Allied governments had every incentive to promote this narrative. Declaring Hitler dead allowed them to proceed with the Nuremberg trials with moral authority. So when the Soviets presented their version of events contradictory and unverifiable, it was accepted not because it was convincing, but because it was convenient. Stalin's Soviet Union played a different game. They used the possibility of Hitler's survival as a weapon of psychological warfare, keeping their former allies off balance. In the West, once the narrative became established, it took on a life of its own. To question the story became almost heretical. The media played its part, lumping serious discussions about Hitler's possible escape together with fringe theories, ensuring that legitimate questions would be dismissed. Williams doesn't argue that there was some grand conspiracy. Instead, he suggests something more subtle, that the world actively chose not to look too closely at inconvenient facts. Sometimes the most powerful lies are the ones we tell ourselves because the truth is too difficult to accept. So here we are, at the end of a journey that's taken us through classified files, remote villages, scientific laboratories, and the corridors of power. We've seen how the story of Hitler's death, accepted without question by 3 generations, rests on evidence that wouldn't hold up in any legitimate courtroom. We've learned about escape networks that saved thousands of Nazi war criminals, networks that could easily have saved one more fugitive. We've heard from witnesses whose testimony has been ignored for 70 years. And we've discovered that the one piece of physical evidence supporting the official story belonged to someone else entirely. Most importantly, we've explored why the world was so eager to accept a comforting lie instead of confronting an uncomfortable truth. Gerrard Williams doesn't claim to know exactly what happened in that Berlin bunker, but he's made a compelling case that we don't know either, despite decades of pretending otherwise. The truth about Hitler's death may be lost to history, but the questions Williams raises are very much alive, and they deserve answers. What do you think about these shocking revelations? How does it feel to discover that one of the most accepted facts of the 20th century might be built on nothing more than wishful thinking? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this investigation has opened your eyes to the gaps in our official history, share this video with others who might be ready to question what they've been told. Because the truth, however uncomfortable it might be, is always worth pursuing. Thanks for staying with me on this remarkable journey. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep demanding evidence, and never stop searching for the truth.